Hello, this is going to be a short lecture on social welfare policies. So an economic policy, or the era of social welfare economic policy, really starts with the Roosevelt era of the New Deal in the 1930s. We saw a rise in Keynesian economics, which is the opposite of the belief that the government should manage the economy. That the government should not manage the economy. Today, the U.S. economic policy lies somewhere in between the Keynesian and Hayek theories. If you haven't watched the rap song yet, you really need to. But yeah, today we fall somewhere in between like the New Deal social policies and the kind of hands-off views of Hayek. The government, according to more modern presidencies and Congresses, have agreed that the government should regulate and sometimes manage the economy, but should allow a free market whenever is possible. So a good example of that would be the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, which completely eliminated economic regulations of commercial airlines over several years. It also led to some protests from air traffic controllers. The budget. Budgeting of public funds is one of the most important decision-making processes of the government, and nothing reflects the growth in public policy and the rise of big government more clearly than the increased spending by the federal government in a lot of public policy issues. So I'll give you some examples throughout the PowerPoint. The first two that I'll give are NAFTA and CAFTA. We've talked about NAFTA in class a little bit. That was passed in '94 under the Clinton administration. And it's a free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. CAFTA is a similar policy passed in 2005 under the Bush administration, which eliminates trade barriers, in other words, free trade between the U.S. and 5 Central American countries: Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, along with the Dominican Republic and the Caribbean. And in class we talked about kind of the pros and cons of those, so I'm not going to get too far into them. So interest groups there are linking institutions that encourage different types of policy. Interest groups play a very powerful role in the creation of economic policy because they can demand policy that reflects their area of interest, and they can put pressure on Congress and the executive branch to do their bidding, though arguably it's more beneficial to put pressure on Congress because they have unlimited terms, and the president, you can only pressure for like 2 terms, and then you might have to switch political allegiances as an interest group. Political parties can also demand the policy to reflect their political beliefs. They can apply pressure to both Congress and the executive branch, which does work really well. And then elections, of course, are a reflection of the way that the public perceives the job, how well the government is doing their jobs. Candidates advocate for the creation or dissolution of public policy, and voters show their agreement or disagreement by voting for or against said candidates. One of the reasons that people vote the most is about the economy, and we see higher numbers of voter turnout in times when people think that the government is not doing enough to fix the economy. Public opinion can sway the creation of policy, usually the most noticeable with political elites, but polls, letters, or protests can also influence policy. The media obviously also influences how policy is regarded and implemented. It can affect government actions. So this is your first flipped assignment. It's just 2 multiple choice questions. I know the A, B, C, and D are kind of hard to see, but feel free to pause this. Your first question is, which of the following indicates that the United States is a mixed economy, meaning a little bit of socialism and a little bit of capitalism? And then your next question, the purpose of an antitrust policy is to do which of the following? All right, so social welfare policy is a term that encompasses a wide variety of government programs which are designed to protect people's health, their physical well-being, provide education and employment opportunities, to create more equality across the board, to enable citizens to lead secure and productive lives. Social welfare policies generally deal with healthcare, income, security, education, and then a bunch of other things. So we'll start with healthcare. Healthcare is controversial today, obviously. In 1993, President Bill Clinton proposed a plan to provide all citizens with basic insurance coverage for doctor fees, hospitalization, and prescription drugs. It's a lot closer to like what Bernie Sanders and also kind of Donald Trump were proposing during the 2016 election cycle. The Congress defeated the bill. Hillary Clinton played a big hand, though, in getting health care for children at least passed that year. And of course the ACA passed in 2009, and the government is currently like working to see if they can dismantle it and replace it with something else. So it's a really hot button topic, but you guys know that. So even though it is very controversial, most people do accept that the government does have a role in medical research and regulating food and drugs. Public health services, they research, they gather information, they monitor healthcare. The Food and Drug Administration regulates the labeling and processing of foods, drugs, and cosmetics. The Center for Disease Control, which everyone knows because of The Walking Dead, works with communicable diseases and potential threats. And they gained new importance after the 2001 anthrax scare following the September 11th attacks on the Trade Center and the Pentagon and potentially the White House. If you don't know what the anthrax scare is, you should at least Wikipedia it. It's really fascinating, and I don't think that we ever found out who was behind the anthrax attacks. Formally, there have been a few suspects. I could be wrong, but... Alright. Income security. Most Americans during their lifetimes will be the recipients of government welfare, and that's just due to the increase in the wealth gap in the United States. That's just a statistic. The most extensive single welfare program is Social Security, and again, that's something that everyone gets. It's not merit-based. It's a social insurance plan for the elderly, the poor, and the disabled. So basically, if you make it to old age, you're going to get it. If you make below the poverty line or you have a disability, you're also eligible for it. Employees and employers contribute to the fund through payroll taxes, and virtually everyone who contributes for at least 10 years is eligible for payments. Other public assistance programs include Medicaid and Medicare. Medicare was established by LBJ, and it provides medical care to the elderly Social Security recipients, so it's kind of a piggyback on Social Security. Medicaid is an expansion of Medicare, and this subsidizes medical care for the poor, and also the disabled. And then we've got the Fair Housing Act of 1968. That was part of the Great Society under LBJ. It prohibited the discrimination of landlords and real estate companies and municipalities, banks, and other lending institutions and homeowners insurance companies whose discriminatory practices made housing unavailable to persons because of race, ethnic group, national origin, gender, or disability. So it got rid of all that. Then there's the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement Modernization Act, which we call Medicare Part D. This is legislation that provided seniors and individuals with disabilities with prescription drug benefits, more choices, and cheaper drugs. Then there's TANF, which most people associate with welfare. It's the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. It was started in 1997. It was started under the Clinton administration. And it's got a conservative spin on it. It's the idea that you give welfare to people who need it, but it's based on the philosophy that they do so while getting job training or while actively doing something to look for work. So TANF is very obviously temporary, which is why it's called the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. There's education policy as well. Public education is generally regarded as the responsibility of states and local communities, so the federal government in this area is actually pretty limited. In our state, they make up maybe 10% of our funding. At least it was around that last time I checked. It's probably gone down. I don't know. But one good example of how the federal government gets involved in education is through the Federal Student Loan Program, which is probably going to be really important to you all. Moving forward into college, they also fund programs like Head Start for preschoolers and focus on programs for underprivileged children in public schools. Like a lot of lunches and things like that are funded through the federal government. The federal government in most states fund less than 10% of the total amount of education's revenue spent in the United States. as far as education policies go, in 1975, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act was passed, and it mandated that every child is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Prior to 1975, public schools would turn people with disabilities away and insist that they go to an institution to live or something like that. You guys have seen Forrest Gump. And then George W. Bush, of course, implemented No Child Left Behind, which is a program that sets standards and schedules for testing and a more cohesive curriculum across the states and teacher qualifications. It's been controversial, and we've talked a lot about that. A lot of it stems from the fact that it's an unfunded mandate on the states, and it's expensive to test, and not always the most rational route, but those are all things we talked about in class. Other domestic policies that have been passed include the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed in 1965, the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Communications Decency Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the Telecommunications Act, the Voting Rights Act. So if you ever have an FRQ that asks you to identify a public policy and explain it, here's a good list. All right, that's all for this lecture. I will see you all tomorrow. Have a good afternoon.